Thank you all for joining us for another session of the CARES Act conference. We're going to be focusing today on CARES Act and the HOPWA waiver flexibilities as it comes to everyone's absolute favorite topics, monitoring and reporting. So my name is Steve Ellis. I work with the Cloudburst group. I'm here with my coworker, Heather Rhoda, also with the Cloudburst group. And with us today from the Office of HIV Housing is Claire Donzi and Jeffrey Keeman. They are there in the background when we get to questions and answers in case they are needed. So thank you everyone again for your time today, and let's jump right into some exciting material. So our agenda today, we've broken up today's presentation into 3 sections. So the first 2 sections have to do with some of the waivers and flexibilities. So we'll start with talking about the differences between regular HOPWA and HOPWA CARES Act, and particularly how to look at those differences and monitor for those differences. Then in section 2, we're going to talk about the waivers that are available to all of the communities across all of your funding sources for HOPWA, and then how to monitor for those. And then we're going to turn and talk about CARES Act reporting requirements with a quick reminder for the formula grantees as some of this information has gone out, and then focus on some of the differences for APR reporting for our competitive friends listening today. And Heather, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So you can go to the next slide. So before we begin with section 1, we just wanted to give a brief kind of overview about monitoring and what this the first 2 sections of this presentation are about. This is really focusing on a targeted subject, as Steve mentioned. And for those who have been grantees in the past, we all know what you do when you monitor programs, right? And for those project sponsors, they know what it's like when they get monitored by a grantee. But generally, how grantees monitor project sponsors will be the same, right? You'll either be using remote monitoring methods or on-site monitoring methods, depending upon your community's safe distancing practices, etc. We also all know that monitoring involves reviewing core HOPWA program requirements to determine compliance with regulations. But what a grantee looks for in terms of client and financial documentation itself may be different as a result of changes brought about by the CARES Act flexibilities and by the waivers outlined in the HOPWA-CPD, specifically HOPWA waiver notices. This is what we'll be reviewing today. There are 2 resources here on this slide that we wanted to highlight. First of all is the HOPWA Grantee Oversight Resource Guide. While the target audience is for grantee, this resource guide is a really good tool. Even for project sponsors to take a look at and use as they're setting up their own, internal monitoring processes, and will also give you a good sense of what a grantee would be looking for in general, just as part of monitoring. Also, another fantastic resource is HOPWA-CPD Monitoring Handbook, Chapter 10. This chapter and accompanying exhibits are a great tool to review to prepare for monitoring in general. Next slide. So, section 1, HOPWA CARES Act. Here we're going to take a look at STRMU time limits and administrative cost caps. Next slide. So what are some monitoring considerations regarding STRMU time limits? Here on the slide, you can see this is related to the CARES Act. The CARES Act allows for providing STRMU assistance for up to 24 months from 21 weeks in any 52-week period. Some of the key elements associated with monitoring that you might want to be aware of include ensure that client files indicate a good faith effort to achieve permanent stable housing. This could be noted in case notes, housing service plans, and continued assessment for assistance. Make sure to find from the financial perspective that staff time and activity delivery costs are not duplicated across regular and HOPWA CARES Act funding. And also make sure too that your HOPWA program policies and procedures are updated to reflect just how CARES Act STRMU assistance will be provided. How do you assess clients? Items like how do you assess clients for ongoing assistance? How do you, determine that extended assistance is needed beyond the normal regulatory timeframes? We do have some recommendations, and we've included each of these on all the slides throughout the presentation. We do recommend that now for households that have been getting assistance, right? Extended STRMU assistance, you begin planning for how the assisted households will be transitioned from extended STRMU assistance to another type of housing assistance, or no housing assistance at all if they're stably housed. And that's completely applicable, based on individualized housing service plans. Next slide, please. Another monitoring consideration includes administrative cost caps. The CARES Act increased allowable administrative cost caps. So grantees are up to 6% of the total allocation. So remember, it was 3%. Now it's up to, for those funding, it's up to 6% of the total allocation. And for project sponsors, it's up to 10% of the subaward. Some key elements include ensure, and this is for CARES Act funding, but really all administrative costs, ensure only eligible administrative costs are charged to the administrative budget line. Another recommendation we have is remind project sponsors, and as a grantee, continue to remind yourself that the increased administrative cap apply to only CARES Act funds. Next slide. So we've covered section 1, the STRMU time limits associated with the CARES Act and administrative caps. So what's section 2 about? In this section, we're going to take a look at monitoring considerations related to regular and HOPWA CARES Act funding associated with using the HUD HOPWA CPD waivers. As a reminder, these waivers only apply if a grantee has notified HUD of its intention to use any of the waivers. As you can see here, we're going to be touching on self-certification of income, incredible information about HIV status, property standards, rent standards waiver, short-term supported housing time limits, including STRMU, and short-term emergency housing, hotel and motel. Next slide. But before we delve into section 2, we wanted to talk a little bit about what we have here as an example as a tracking tool to track HUD CPD waivers that are being used. We want to make it clear that this isn't a requirement at all, but we have been working with a grantee and a project sponsor and found that they had created an internal tracking tool to keep track of all the waivers they had been using, right? For whom and for which unit. We do recommend creating this tool so that you can just simply remember which waivers you used for each individual client, and for waivers like the rent standard or the property standards when you need to do re-inspections for initial inspections that were conducted remotely. As you can see here, it's a very simple tool. It's got a client ID, date the waiver was applied. It also gives you a little reminder. Do you have documentation of the waiver in the file? When does the waiver expire? When is it completed? And also at the bottom, there's some tabs for each individual waiver. So it's a really good idea just to have, so when you're planning which clients and which files you need to take a look at. Next slide. Okay, so the waivers themselves. So let's take a look at self-certification of income. So generally, self-certification of income has always been allowable, right? In HUD's hierarchy of, income documentation, self-certification has been, one of the acceptable forms of verification. But what this waiver did was allowed for immediate use of self-certification of income rather than source documentation. And this was to make sure that clients weren't waiting, to receive assistance or waiting for source documentation. And at the time, a lot of, employment places, weren't following through with providing source documentation very quickly. So this waiver allowed for, like I said, immediate use of this option. Just be aware though, this waiver expires and the deadline for obtaining source documentation is September 30th, 2021. Some key elements: ensure that client files contain a copy of the applicable waiver, if you used it, and completed self-certification form. And also ensure that client files can contain a copy of any source documentation that was obtained after the fact that was applicable to this waiver. What we recommend is now you start attempting to collect source documentation of income. You can work very closely with your HOPWA program participants to collect that information, either obtained from them or also work with them to sign a release of information, which then can be sent to the source, and you might be able to obtain that information on your own. The program might be able to do it. One thing we wanted to point out: if source documentation for income is still not available after you've tried, you've attempted to get it, just make sure households update the self-certification that was previously used to make sure that everything that they self-certified in the beginning is still correct. And make sure a copy of that update is also included in the client file. Next slide. So the next one, this is related to credible information about HIV status. This waiver allowed for immediate use of credible information. This also included self-certification to document HIV status. The waiver expiration and deadline for obtaining source documentation is September 30th, 2021. Some key elements: ensure that files contain a copy of the applicable waiver and completed self-certification of HIV status or any other form of documentation other than source documentation that you used, right, to document HIV status. We do recommend now, because September will be here sooner than we know it, to start attempting to collect source documentation of HIV status. In most cases, we have found for self-certification of income and HIV status, some programs have been able to obtain the source documentation all along, or have used self-certification of income and HIV status, and then immediately started following up to get that source documentation. So if you haven't done that, definitely start attempting to collect that information. Next slide. So property standards. This waiver was related to housing conducting inspections. Okay. This waiver only applies to initial inspections, which part of doing an inspection includes conducting a lead-based paint visual inspection as applicable. This waiver expires September 30th, 2021. This also includes needing to conduct on-site inspections by 12/31/21, December 31st, 2021, for all units in which an initial inspection was conducted remotely. So what are some things you should have in your client files, or what are some monitoring elements you should be aware of? ensure that client files, like every other waiver we've been talking about, contains a copy of the applicable waiver itself. Ensure that client files contain a completed housing quality standards or HOPWA habitability inspection form, clearly indicating on that form that a virtual initial inspection was completed. And also, when you're going back to do the physical inspections for those units that were initially inspected remotely, make sure you've completed another housing quality standards and HOPWA habitability inspection form, indicating that that inspection was conducted on site. And also another key element is to ensure that HOPWA program policies and procedures are updated to reflect conducting initial inspections remotely using technology, the information that was detailed in the waivers. That include information such as like live streaming, pre-recorded videos or photographs. And also make sure policies and procedures include information about needing to go back and conduct an on-site inspection for those units. So if you haven't already, we recommend start developing a schedule and begin completing on-site inspections for all units where an initial inspection was conducted remotely. Remind project sponsors that this waiver only applies to initial inspections. Next slide. So rent standard. What are some monitoring considerations regarding rent standard? Normally, rent standards, which is the maximum allowable rent, including utilities for a unit, per HOPWA regulations, must be established using either the FMR, fair market rent, or by adopting the HUD community-wide exception rent. This waiver essentially allowed grantees a third option when establishing rent standards, basically based on rent reasonableness, right? The waiver permitted grantees to establish rent standards by unit size that are reasonable based on rents being charged for comparable unassisted units in the area. That's rent reasonableness. This waiver expires December 31st, 2021. Some key elements to be aware of: ensure that client files include documentation of the rent standard waiver. And if you are establishing rent standards using this waiver, ensure that client files include completed rent reasonableness checklists and certification forms. Recommendations: make sure you know which units this waiver applies to, right? This is where that tracking sheet that we showed earlier would come in really handy. Now, begin planning for how rent standards will be adjusted. There is some current guidance on this, but there's still, that's a little bit fluid, so stay tuned because there'll be more coming out about adjusting rent standards back to normal procedures. Next slide. So here we're talking about STRMU and short-term emergency housing time limits. I've broken these out into two, as you'll see here. For STRMU, this waiver extended the eligibility period from 21 weeks in a 52-week period to 12 months in a 12-month period, or just essentially 52 weeks, right? For short-term emergency housing, hotel, motel, this extended the time limit from 60 days to 120 days. This waiver expires December 31st, 2021. Next slide, please. So, what are some things you should be aware of and some key elements? Ensure that the client files include documentation of the waiver, right? STRMU, short-term emergency housing. Also make sure that client files include documentation of good faith efforts to assist the household achieve and stabilize permanent housing. Like we mentioned earlier in the beginning regarding using CARES Act for STRMU for the 24-month period, this kind of documentation could be included in case notes, ongoing assessments, housing care plans. Also, Ensure client files include documentation granting STRMU extensions as applicable. Another item to be aware of is that HOPWA policy should include written details outlining efforts to regularly assess household and also a process for granting extensions, just so that that is applied consistently across all households. A recommendation for households receiving STRMU under this waiver or participating receiving short-term emergency housing assistance, begin planning for transitioning those households to stable permanent housing. And next slide, please. Steve, I think you're up.
I am. Thank you, Heather, for that material. So we're going to shift now to a different topic and talk about how you're going to report on the work that you've done. So throughout the pandemic, throughout different HOPWA webinars, and during the HOPWA-CV implementation webinar yesterday, you all heard about some of the things that you're able to do, some of the additional flexibilities, and the great work that HOPWA programs can do to prepare, prevent, and respond to the coronavirus pandemic. And you all have been doing really excellent work. Some examples: the AIDS Action Committee of Boston has been using their CARES Act money to help stabilize some of their current program participants in housing while helping others face food insecurity. Bernal Heights in California has been using the funds to collaborate with community partners for eviction prevention and to minimize barriers to housing. Kingsport Housing Authority has been using it to help cover additional costs that have gone up during the pandemic. Franny Peabody Center in Maine has been using it to help put individuals into hotel motel for temporary situations across the state of Maine. Other programs have been using it, such as AIDS Chicago, to help put people quickly into hotels while they're working on other permanent housing, particularly those current facing homelessness, to help keep homeless shelters as clear as possible. AIDS Action Inc. of Massachusetts has been using this to help individuals get food either delivered or groceries delivered to help reduce the spread and to help not put people at high risk into the community. So I said, so you all have been using these funds for really great purposes. But as you are all aware, that great work still somehow needs to be reported on. So that way HOPWA and your local field office and the community is aware of what you've been doing with it. So that's now where we're going to talk about reporting, how you take the great work that you've been doing it and putting it to paper. So the first one we're going to focus on is our some reminders for everyone. So the HOPWA program performance profiles, or the reports, are the same forms, particularly for the formula grantees, the 40110D. And then for your regular competitive funds, it's the same report for the APR, the 40110C. Some reminders that all reports are still due within 90 days of the end of the appropriate operating year. However, the operating year may be different and will be different whether you're a formula or a competitive grantee. It is worth noting that the information that you put on your HOPWA reports, particularly the CAPER, is going to ask different questions and report on different topics that aren't included in any of your other HUD reports, particularly the CPD CAPER that many of you will put into IDIS. So keep in mind, particularly if you're new to reporting, that this is a whole new level of reporting that is a requirement for your grant. So now to dive into some of the CARES Act specifics, we're going to start with a reminder for formula friends out there who, as you know, we're going to fill out the CAPER. So the HOPWA CARES reporting follows the same operating year as other HOPWA dollars. So therefore, there's no need for the project sponsors and grantees out there to worry about different operating years. Whatever operating year you've always been on is the exact same operating year for your formula dollars. So therefore, all HOPWA data, including your households and expenditures from any allocation, including your HOPWA CARES Act allocation, are combined into one CAPR. So once again, all the formula grantees are going to submit one combined CAPR for all of their allocations, including any HOPWA CARES Act. Within that combined CAPR, please do not separate households and expenditures within any of the tables or cells. Please feel free in the narrative section to describe any differences, to break out anything there, to describe anything special or unique or really successful that you did with your CARES Act funds. But within the tables and cells that you are all familiar with, do not separate any of those. So the trick, particularly with project sponsors, as they are submitting data to the grantee through whatever methodology that grantee asks for, is that project sponsors are going to have to deduplicate households within HOPWA activities, particularly since many of you are spending on different allocations and different contracts at the same time. So to help you with that, we have an example. So our particular HOPWA program has assisted 75 households with regular formula HOPWA funds. With these regular funds, they spent $275,000. They've also assisted 50 households with their HOPWA CARES Act formula funds and spent $75,000 of those dollars on STRMU. However, while we did serve 125 total households, it turns out that 25 of those households are actually duplicative. So they access both your regular and your CARES Act STRMU. So therefore, project sponsors, as you fill this out, you're only going to report on 100 households within that activity line. So you'll see that as an example on the picture here. However, you'll note that we have combined all of the expenditures, a total of $350,000 within your HOPWA actual line. So for those of you who are currently in the process of collecting your formula CAPR data or getting ready to start, project sponsors are going to need to think through how they combine all of these households and do their best to deduplicate within activities. Otherwise, there was a webinar earlier in the year that talked about this report. So if you have any other questions, formula grantees, please feel free to reach to look through that webinar or reach out to the HOPWA Cloudburst data validation team. Otherwise, we're now going to move on to our competitive friends. So for many of you, the material that we're going to be going over is new, as the CARES Act reporting information has just recently come out. So I want to reiterate yet again that the APR is for HOPWA competitive grantees only. So if you are a formula grantee or a project sponsor under a formula grantee, you do not need to worry about filling out the competitive grantee APR. So some notes and some things to highlight. So the HOPWA CARES Act reporting follows a different operating year than all of your other HOPWA-C or HOPWA competitive dollars. So once again, your HOPWA CARES Act reporting follows a different operating year than your other HOPWA competitive funds. Therefore, grantees should track and follow these different operating years to make sure that you are reporting on the correct data, as well as submitting your reports when they are due. So your HOPWA competitive and HOPWA competitive CARES Act operating years are based upon when your grant agreement is signed, not your nonprofit or organization's operating year. So because you might have some differences in how your organization operates versus this operating year for your HOPWA funds, see box 14 of your CCV grant agreement, or if you have access to IDIS, go to view and then view grant term. That way you are 100% sure of when your operating year starts and then when that first operating year will end. Now for for grantees out there who have more than one HOPWA competitive grant, you are aware that you've always had to separate those reports into different APRs. So this guidance applies to that same principle. But if you're a competitive grantee that's only had one and now you have a second competitive grant, this will be new for you. So what we want to stress is that all of your HOPWA competitive grant funds must be reported separately from all of your other HOPWA funds. This includes your HOPWA CARES Act funding. So grantees were allocated their HOPWA CARES Act competitive funds based on the number of regular competitive grants that they received. So an example that you'll see here is we have a grantee funded with 2 HOPWA competitive grants. So therefore they would have been allocated 2 HOPWA competitive CARES Act grants. When it comes to reporting on the APR, this means they're going to have to submit 2 different regular HOPWA CARES Act APRs, as well as 2 different HOPWA CARES Act APRs. So therefore, they're going to submit 4 different APRs, 2 for regular competitive and 2 for competitive CARES to HUD within a 12-month period. So particularly for those of you that are gearing up to start looking at and reporting on your CARES Act funds, you need to be mindful of all these materials. That way you can select your correct operating year, know when your date is due, but also make sure that you're separating funds, particularly if you have more than one CARES Act award. So when it comes to actually reporting on these funds, it's worth noting that the form that you've all been able to use is really the same form for CARES Act. However, there are some differences, and stressing there's a lot less that you need to fill out when reporting your HOPWA CARES Act funds. Now it's worth noting you can complete the entire 40110C APR if you'd like, but it is not a requirement. For your CARES Act funds, not all charts are required, and only some parts of charts are required. For example, the number of assisted households and some demographics. I'm sure for excitement from many of you listening who fill this out, financials are not required when you're filling out your APR for your CARES Act reporting. For this particular circumstance under the CARES Act, all of your financial information is going to be collected via IDIS. So as was touched on a little bit yesterday during the financial management session with Jonathan Sherwood talking to the HOPWA program, there's some stuff about IDIS that you need to be aware of to make sure all of this is lining up, particularly when it comes to reporting. But for today, I'm just going to add to it, you need to make sure that before you submit your CARES Act APR, that you've completed all of your necessary IDIS draws. So that way, when programs and the HUD offices are combining your submitted APR with IDIS, it's going to be able to line up. To make sure to do that, particularly pay special attention to the actual cost incurred date. This will be key since you won't be reporting on your financials. So for more information on the actual cost incurred date, please refer to the financial management webinar from yesterday, or reach out to any of the technical assistance providers that you're connected with, reach out to the Cloudburst data validation team, or submit an AAQ, because we're definitely here to help you understand and select the right dates. So therefore your CARES Act APR lines up correctly. So as I mentioned, that only parts of the regular APR needs to be filled out. And here you'll see a chart that talks about what is required. So for those of you that know the APR by the actual part number, it's listed here, and then we'll talk about whether it's all or whether certain sections. If things aren't listed here, then they're not required. So definitely, as you're filling this out, review this chart against your actual APR to make sure you're only filling out the necessary information that you're required to fill out. For those of you who have seen the CARES Act APR, you will notice, but for those of you who haven't, we're going to show you some examples of what you will see in this form to help you understand what's required. So for example, here's the part 1, the performance and expenditures information by activity type. As I mentioned, we are going to need the number of households that were served with any of your CARES Act activities that were funded, that you wrote into your application, that were approved and entered into IDIS as set up. So you do need to give us the number of households that received all of these types of assistance. But when you look at the CARES Act only APR, you'll notice that there are a number of boxes that are grayed out. If it's grayed out, that means that it's not required for you to enter. So for example, on this particular chart, as I mentioned before, financials are not required to be entered on your CARES Act only APR. So when you look at this APR, please look throughout just to see where those grayed out boxes are so you know what information can be skipped. What you'll also see throughout different parts of the CARES Act only APR is a few notes that have been inserted to help you think through some of the issues that might arise. So for example, for those of you who fill out the APR, you're aware of the prior living situation chart when you get down to some of the demographics section. For most of the prior living situation, HUD isn't requiring most of the different types of categories. What you will note though, and is highlighted here, is HUD is asking about the total number of individuals who do meet HUD's definition of homelessness. So that note is here to highlight that as a requirement for addressing, and you'll see here the notes add a few comments for what those definitions are, so that way you don't lose in what's been grayed out. So for those of you who do not currently have the CARES Act APR, reach out to the Cloudburst data validation team. We will email it to you. We have been emailing it to everyone as their report comes due as we send the 90-day reminder, but we're happy to share it with anyone else who needs to look at it beforehand. Because otherwise we aren't going to be reviewing the full CARES Act APR during this webinar. So please review, reach out if you have questions, and as always, we are more than happy to help you all fill out your reporting to show the great work that you've been doing. So some final reminders about reporting, particularly CARES Act reporting. So once again, formula grantees and formula project sponsors submit one combined CAPR. Competitive grantees submit different APRs from your regular competitive, from your CARES Act competitive. Being mindful that the CARES Act only APR is an annotated version of the form that you know, the regular APR, and you will most likely have different operating and due dates for that. However, the submission process is the same. So once your CARES Act only APR is completed, please make sure to submit that report to your local HUD CPD field office representative, to HOPWA@HUD.gov, and to the Cloudburst group, those individuals that have been emailing you to remind you of all of your reports. And then once again, for everyone listening who has any form of reporting, project sponsors, if you have questions, definitely reach out to your grantee. That way they can help you with any specifics that they might have or local requirements for reporting. Grantees, definitely reach out to the Cloudburst group, HOPWA data validation team. As always, we're here to help you all. So just some contact info and resources as we wrap up our PowerPoint and move on to any questions. So you will see on the screen the contact information from myself and Heather. Otherwise, if you do have any other questions or need anything, definitely reach out. So technical assistance is here to help you. So if you're already connected with a technical assistance firm that does HOPWA, reach out to that firm. We'll definitely be able to help you with anything when it comes to monitoring or reporting. Otherwise, you can go to this link here to request technical assistance, or as always, you can submit a HOPWA AAQ through the Ask a Question desk. And that concludes our PowerPoint. Heather, are there any questions?
Yes, there are a few, and some we were able to answer. Questions are solely related to your favorite subject, and that is reporting.
Yes.
Well, there was one question too. Remember the example that we provided in the beginning, that the example like tracking sheet? Mm-hmm. And I can't remember from looking at it in the past. And this is, I think, just a general question. You know how the tracking sheet had different tabs for each waiver. And then on the sheet, there were, headers. generally, are the categories and headers the same across each waiver?
It can be. It's all about your own particular program design,
Exactly.
how you classified it, right?
Yeah.
If your community even notified HUD of your intent to
If you're
use all
even
of those
using the
waivers.
waiver, right?
So any tracking sheet should be a tracking sheet that makes sense for your community, for your project sponsors. That way it's easy to
Absolutely.
use, it's easy to be monitored by the grantee, right? So
Yeah.
whatever makes sense, as long as it can, as you saw in that example, there's also clear steps that you can follow to help yourself make
Exactly.
sure you wrap up these.
Yeah. So, and we can touch on this. So what happens if data like HOPWA-CV data wasn't reported in the 2020 CAPER? So should that be reported in the 2021 CAPER?
So for those of you who did not report on CARES Act formula dollars on your last CAPER, you will include that and roll that into this current CAPER. However, if you did include some of that reporting, you'll definitely keep that out, so you're not reporting on duplicative households and expenditures across two different reports.
Great. Let me see.
I see a quick question about the Cloudburst data validation team.
Yes, the team.
It's the same individuals who have
Same
emailed
team.
you. So myself, Morgan Stevenson, Zanab and Bobby, and Nikki Denninger. So you've received emails from all of us, and so you can just reply all. If you don't have their contact information, you saw the email for Heather and I in this presentation, and we'll make sure that all emails go to the appropriate person.
Great. Great. I think there's one, the CARES Act funds are separate from regular HOPWA funds, like TBRA, for example.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. So the CARES Act funds is a separate allocation. It probably came to your organization through a separate contract. And so while they can cover a lot of the same similar costs, because it's tenant-based rental assistance, they are different. So if, for example, if you did use tenant-based rental assistance or your regular HOPWA for tenant-based rental assistance and CARES Act to cover, say, increased HAP costs because people's income went down and you did your interim rental calculation. If you had an increase in overhead costs due to staff that do rent calcs and virtual inspections needing some technology, right? So if they're duplicating, you're going to have to deduplicate those households to make sure that you're getting to that one number.
Right. How long does it typically take to receive CAPER feedback from the data validation team?
The answer to that is solely dependent on the time of the year.
Right.
So
because they're divided into 4 quarters, and 4 is a giant quarter.
Right. So everyone's particularly, everyone has different operating years for their agencies, for the formula grantees, competitive. You all have different operating years based upon your grant agreement, which constantly changes as you get renewals. And so all the things fall into quarters, as Heather mentioned. And so particularly the quarter that we're in now is the largest because most of you, particularly your formula grantees, just wrapped up your operating year at the end of June. So in these moments, it's particularly hard for us to get feedback right away, just because of the large number of reports that are coming in, particularly now that we're getting some CARES Act reports. But I do encourage you, if you're, instead of looking for particular feedback on an entire report, if you have a specific question, email that specific question, because while we might have a number of reports that we need to review, we're always quick at trying to answer specific questions. As we are aware, it's usually a roadblock to you finishing your report.
Right.
And I'll just sort of add to that too, though, is even if the process is taking a little longer or we can't get to the validation by the time your report's due, please, to meet your HUD obligation, submit your report anyway.
Exactly.
So by that due date that you are aware of, please make sure to submit your report to HOPWA in your local field office. Even if we can't validate it to the back end, have you make corrections and resubmit. That way you're still meeting your obligation.
Right, right. because Cloudburst offers early reviews, right? As, as part of our validation process. But like you said, if you're getting close to the deadline, submit it anyway, and we can still do the data validation after you've submitted it. Because there are some grantees that do that. There's a question for the CAPER. If we combine HOPWA and HOPWA-CV, how do we report grantee and project sponsor admin?
So once again, all of that admin will be reported together as to one expenditure. Right. But everyone, including HUD and HOPWA, is aware that the form does talk about either a 3% or 7% cap, which, as Heather reviewed earlier, is not applicable to your CARES Act. So therefore, everyone's aware that you might be reporting on admin that looks higher. So as long as that number is within a relatively normal range, it will be absolutely fine. But keeping in mind, right, because this is only for formula grantees, right, that if there are any issues or problems, someone will come back and ask for a comment to clarify. But for competitive grantees, you're not going to be reporting on any expenditures. So therefore, HUD and HOPWA will be able to look at your expenditures for admin directly from IDIS, to make sure that you're staying under the caps for CARES Act, and then separately your regular allocation.
There's a couple of questions. I don't know if you've been able to look at the Q&A regarding getting reports, APRs and CAPERs in earlier this year. And I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that, or we could follow up directly with the person who submitted the question. It's a little bit earlier this year than previous years.
Yeah, and so I'll just generally say that, like all of you, right, many of us work under different contracts, and so we're just trying to resolve some issues with the data reporting contract, and so that's why many of you got emails that look like an earlier date from which you are familiar with after years of doing this. So if you have specific instances or circumstances that you'd like to cover, please reach out to us so we can work through those specifics. But to generally address it, right, that's why many of you saw that July 31st date. And if there are any changes or updates to that, we will be the first to email you all, because I am not joking, we absolutely love validating your reports and working with you all to tell a story with your data, the great work that you're doing. So if we can continue to doing that without any delay, you'll be the first to know. Yeah.
So generally, the process, right here, we have another question. Can you confirm that the process for review this year, meaning the timeline to expect a Cloudburst review to be done? That depends on the quarter, right? Yeah.
And that July 31st date. So that's what, again, once again, to reiterate, if your report is due by a certain due date and you haven't heard back from us with a final validation, email, that tier 1 status, please go ahead and submit your report anyway, and make sure to include Cloudburst on it, and we will eventually get to it, and we can help you validate or clean up any data on the back end.
Okay. That is it.
That's all people have for our favorite topics, monitoring and reporting.
Yes, I guess, yes.
Once again, as that reminder, the slides have the email addresses for Heather and I. If it's data specific, please reach out to the Cloudburst data validation team, or for anything HOPWA related, including things like the CARES Act monitoring and reporting, you can reach out for technical assistance or the HOPWA AAQ desk. We're here through whatever method and methodology to help you all.
Absolutely.
All right. I think that is all for today.
Can you repeat the answer to including CARES Act fund not reported in previous CAPER?
Absolutely. So particularly for our formula friends filling out the CAPER, if you included your CARES Act expenditures that you'd already incurred on your previous caper, don't include them on this next caper. But because of the waiver and the extensions for the caper, or when some operating years occur, some communities haven't reported on any CARES Act expenditures, including their last operating year. So if you are aware that your program has not reported on your Formula CARES Act dollars yet, include it on this next report, regardless on how far back it goes from the allowable date for your particular community. That way, this next caper will capture all data that has been unreported.
That is, this is, somebody has a comment. This is more of a comment rather than a question, but I agree with Steve. I like the data validation piece too. It not only keeps me on my toes, but allows us to tell a story.
We will
Thank
quote
you.
that individual on that for the individuals who don't like data validation quite as much. It can be fun.
I think that's it.
All right. Once again, everyone, thank you so much for your time today and for this important topic. Reach out if you need anything. We are here to help you all.
And for any questions, wait, okay.
That weren't addressed, we can address them offline. So
Okay.
I noticed there are a few questions that are a little bit more in the weeds. We'll reach out to you all.
I see that now. I was going through really, really quick, but I see that now. They are a little bit more nuanced. But definitely for any questions that we did not get to during this presentation, we will make sure that we get to them offline. And we'll make sure everybody also too, after this conference, has the slides from this presentation. Remember, as far as monitoring, it's just really about doing your due diligence, right? And keeping track of the waivers that you're using. So you know when the waivers expires and the type of documentation you need, to close out that waiver. And as far as reporting, always feel free to reach out to Cloudburst HOPWA data validation team. I can help too. I've done some data validation in the past, but if Steve will let me.
Always.
Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for attending, and make sure you're listening to the last, I think it's a joint session today.
Duplication of benefits.
Right. Yep. And there's going to be some information about HOPWA.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.